Greetings, History of Sexuality students. This is Professor Bowen here with an instructional video on how to create annotations for your research project. By this point in your research, you've got a topic, you've formulated a research question, and you've also assembled a nice list of primary and secondary sources related to your research question. So the next task is to actually begin the writing. Specifically, here you're going to compose annotations for all of your 10 sources. You may be asking yourself, how exactly am I supposed to do this? What's supposed to go into these annotations? This is perhaps not something you've done before, and I do have very specific things that I'm looking for in these annotations. So, the purpose of this video is to explain those things and alleviate whatever concerns you might have about this second stage of the project. Okay, so first, what exactly are those instructions? At this point in your research, you've got a list of 10 sources, 6 or 7 of which are secondary and 3 or 4 of which are primary sources. For each of these, you'll produce an annotation that consists of about 250 words of descriptive and evaluative commentary. I'll get into exactly what the commentary should contain in a moment, but for now, let me just say that if we're looking at 10 sources, then altogether the annotation should comprise about 2,500 words. So this is a rather substantive piece of work, and doing it well means you'll have a lot of content that you can bring into the final stage of the project. But the annotations aren't the only thing in this submission. Before you get to your annotations, I want you to update your proposal and your bibliography as needed. I gave each of you fairly in-depth feedback on these things, and you've now had a couple of weeks to think about my comments. As such, in this assignment, I would like to see how you're taking my suggestions and criticisms into account. Hopefully, your research question is a bit more targeted than the one that you started out with. Hopefully, you've replaced some of your sources with better sources that more directly and completely address your research question. And perhaps you've made other changes to the project as well. This is all perfectly fine. It's the way research naturally evolves. So, what path are you on now, and how does it compare to the one that you started out down? What's the journey of your research been like since you submitted part 1 of the project? I want to know about all of this. So, before you get to your annotations, please compose a new proposal that gives me a sense of where things stand right now. How have things evolved since we last got in touch? Just tell me, with a short paragraph and an updated bibliography. That's the first thing that you need to do for this assignment. So, how do we actually produce these annotations, and what should go into them? I'm going to talk about secondary and primary source annotations separately because these are very different things and the requirements for each of them are different. And we'll start with secondary source annotations. I thought it would be helpful to provide a sample to give you a kind of template that you might use as you're putting together your own annotations. Feel free to use this one as a kind of formulaic guide if you like. It's actually an annotation that I myself produced when I was in graduate school and I was taking a class on the ancient world, and I did a project that had to do with female healers in ancient Greece. And as part of my research, I found this really interesting paper by an historian called Rebecca Fleming. The paper is called Women, Writing, and Medicine in the Classical World, and I annotated it. I annotated it much like the way you're going to annotate some of your secondary sources for this project. So, what to do? First thing I want to point out right off the bat, before anything else, make sure that you cite the source. Each annotation should begin with the reference to the source itself. Might seem like an obvious point, but it's one that people often forget. So do make sure to start with the actual citation. And then, from there on, as I said before, you're going to have 2 paragraphs for each annotation, roughly. My suggestion would be that you divide them this way. Make the first paragraph more descriptive, where you're summarizing what the historian is doing in the paper. And then in the second paragraph, you can get more analytical and cast judgment on their claims. So, first paragraph, more of a summary. I want you to start out by getting into their argument as quickly as possible. From the very first sentence of your annotation, I want to know, what is this person trying to prove? What is the major claim, in other words, that they are advancing in this book or essay or journal article, whatever it is? Get right to the heart of the matter. Let us know what it is that they're trying to convince us of. And you can take a couple of sentences to explain what their basic argument is in the paper. When you do that, I'd like you to get into the details in a number of ways. First, I want to know a little bit about how the author reached their conclusion. Or in other words, what is the foundation or the basis on which their argument stands? What kinds of sources were they looking at? And you can list these. As you can see in this annotation, I've said Fleming uses literary and archaeological sources. Okay, that's good. It's also a little bit vague, so you can get more specific with it. You can talk about, well, what kinds of literary evidence does she use? Books? Name those books. Archaeological artifacts? Tell me a little bit about those as well. That's kind of what I do for the rest of this paragraph, right? And I do that in a way that connects these sentences to the overall point that the author is trying to make. So in this first paragraph, when you're summarizing the argument, make sure you talk about the evidence that the author uses to try to illustrate or back up their. Now, there's one thing that, shame on me, I forgot to do with this sample annotation, and I want to talk about that because it's something that I would like you to do. I would like you to do a little bit better than what I just showed you for your own annotation, and that is this. I would like you to talk about how this particular source, that you're annotating actually speaks to you personally about your research question and about the thing that you want to answer in your project, right? So talk about the specific insights that you have gleaned from this source and how they relate to the things that you're trying to figure out in your research. Make it personal. All right, so that takes care of secondary source annotations, but what about primary sources? So some of these things are going to be very similar to your secondary source annotations. For one, you're always going to start with the citation itself, but on the whole, these are very different things, right? Your primary sources, obviously, they're not written by a historian. They're not scholarly in any sense, really. So you're not going to do things like describe the author's argument and critique it. There's not going to be that kind of descriptive or analytical content in the primary source annotation. So what actually am I looking for here? Okay, so we said start with the citation, and then I would like you to talk about, to the extent you can, the circumstances of production for the source. This, I realize, might not always be possible because sometimes we don't know the authors of primary sources. There's a lot of these that are just anonymous because they were written by an unknown person or because we lost track of who this person was. It, in those cases, just can't be stated with certainty. If that's the case for you, you can offer an educated guess by saying, this source was likely written by a physician, or it appears to have been composed by a poet or something like that. You can give a kind of rough sense of who the author might have been. And often, especially when we're dealing with sources in the ancient or the pre-modern worlds, you might not know when the source was first created or published. You might not know where it appeared, if it was part of some larger collection, if it was a book, if it was a document produced for governmental authorities, or what have you. But again, to the extent that you can, talk about when it was published, where it was published, and what it was created for, the kind of the purpose of the document. In addition to these things, in your primary source annotation, I want you to kind of briefly summarize the entire source. And there are a few key things here that all historians do whenever they're annotating primary sources, and we do this in our own research. Talk about a couple of different things. One is the audience. Who do you think that this source was produced for? Who is the intended reader of whatever text it is that you have come across? Again, you can't do this with certainty, but you probably can get a general sense from your reading of it. And in addition to talking about the possible audience for the source, you can certainly talk about the author's aims. Audience and aims are really important for understanding primary sources. What was it that they were trying to accomplish in this source? What do you have as a sense of their goals, their reasons for writing it? Were they trying to persuade someone of something? Were they trying to inform a particular person or a group of people about an event or a set of circumstances? Again, these things aren't always readily available upon reading primary source text, but to the best of your ability, talk about their audiences and their aims. Again, I also want you to get personal here. So talk about how the source speaks to your own research questions, about the insights that it contains for you and your own project, and just like with the secondary sources, get into the details. Talk about specific passages, cite specific words, and try to put it in dialogue with your secondary sources. All right, that's all I've got for now. Hope this video was helpful. See you later.